Cold Seed, Beneath the Ice, by Mikael Lundt. Chapter 1. U.S. Base, Camp Century, Greenland, August 2nd, 1967. Paul Memphis's heavy boots crunched on the hard-packed ice of the tunnel floor as he hurried along the narrow shaft. The ground was so hard due to the severe frost that it sounded as if he was walking over coarse gravel with every step. What's more, the sound echoed unnaturally loudly from the smooth walls that bordered the tunnel on all sides. 12 meters of ice upwards, a few kilometers downwards, and, depending on the direction, 80 to 800 kilometers to the sides. Before he was stationed on Greenland, Memphis had never imagined how immense the ice masses were here, how huge the dimensions of the glacier were, and how enormous the problems were that the ice caused every day down here in the tunnels. The frosty air gradually burned in Memphis's lungs, forcing him to slow down a little. The vapor from his breath poured out of his mouth in thick white clouds and condensed instantly. It was 25 degrees below zero in the tunnel, making it only slightly warmer than on the surface. As he had run most of the way, he was sweating under his thick polar gear. After so many months, he hardly cared about the cold anyway. The lights in the corridor flickered for a moment, and then went out completely for a brief second. Memphis stopped abruptly and imagined with growing unease what would happen if the lights failed forever. He hated the thought. Impenetrable darkness met unrelenting cold that wanted to suck the life out of him. The light promptly returned, and Memphis called himself to order. He had to keep going. The incessant crunching of his boots was increasingly mixed with cracking and roaring. He knew that the surface above him was a hive of activity. Up there, the numerous caterpillar vehicles that were to take the equipment and crew away from here forever were being loaded on a piecework basis. This had been happening since this morning when he and his Danish colleague Erik Jansson brought the first load of equipment to the surface. The soldiers' unusual haste had been ordered from the very top, and Memphis himself was also clear. They had to hurry. He would have preferred to go with Jansson, who was surely already halfway home. But he had to stay because some stubborn fellow scientists were still reluctant to leave this gigantic block of ice on the edge of civilization. Unfortunately, despite the commander's warnings, one of these scientists was his boss, who had sent him out to collect samples shortly before his departure. He had no idea why. There was no time left for them to analyze anything. At the end of the tunnel, one of the many isolated huts that the military had built into the shafts in the glacier over the last few years appeared. Memphis climbed the few steps and entered the hut, which was still several degrees below zero. He burst into the middle of an argument between his superior scientist, Dr. Sterling, and the base commander, Major Wurlitz. "I'll ask you one last time. What are you still doing here? Why aren't you finished? We're moving out," Wurlitz shouted around the laboratory, where Dr. Frank Sterling continued to pack ice cores unperturbed. "We're going as fast as we can," he explained coolly. "Leave that junk," Wurlitz said sharply. "And all the results? The equipment? We have to—" Dr. Sterling started and then waved it off. Memphis, meanwhile, walked around the large experiment table and stood next to Sterling. He placed the case with the samples he had collected on the table. "I don't think you heard me right, Dr. Sterling," Wurlitz yelled. "We're moving out now. This base is history. We'll leave everything here, fill in this goddamn hole, and never come back. Got it? You said yourself that the situation can't be controlled effectively. With all due respect, don't you see the unprecedented opportunities?" Sterling tried to object, but Wurlitz cut him off. "That's enough. Pack up your things and let's get out of here. You have half an hour. After that, the last entrances will be closed, and I'm beginning not to care if you're still here by then." The major turned around and addressed one of his soldiers, standing silently in a corner. "You make sure those eggheads are on the surface in 30 minutes at the latest." "Understood, sir." 30 minutes to departure, the soldier reported, and nodded. Then Wurlitz left the room with jagged steps. "You know he's right," Paul Memphis now said, giving Dr. Sterling a worried look. "If we don't leave, the ice will swallow us up." Sterling smiled mildly. "Hornaks like Wurlitz are great at shouting, but not very good at listening," he commented, switching off a series of measuring devices on the table. "Yes, maybe," Memphis continued. "But we can't stay. They're loading the reactor right now, and in a few hours the batteries will run out. Then we'll be in the dark. under meters of ice. Well, for my part, I got it! Sterling roared but immediately calmed down again. I want to wait for these final results. It could be crucial that we find out what we're dealing with. We'd better leave it. They already know what they're doing, said Memphis. They don't know anything. They're evacuating and covering everything up, hoping it will stay buried forever. But what if that's not enough? What if it finds a way out? We should be prepared for that. And the best way to do that is to find out as much as we can about this phenomenon. We don't have time, and even if we did, I don't think there's anything we can do, Memphis said resignedly, shaking his head. Do you think they'd leave even one of the missiles here if there was the slightest chance of saving the situation? Sterling let out an agonized sigh. No. You're right, of course, but it would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's not worth the risk, as much as I hate to agree with Wurlitz, but after all the incidents and the recent affair with Benjamin Sattler, I don't think anyone can blame him for pulling the ripcord. For a moment, there was silence in the room. Only the muffled rumbling and cracking from the surface prevented an eerie silence from settling in. Then Sterling took the floor again. These cores could still win us the Nobel Prize one day, he said, without the slightest hint of modesty in his voice. At the same time, he shook his head, as if he could hardly believe his own words. Maybe, at some point. But not if we don't make it out of here alive, Memphis interjected. Then we'll finish packing and take as much as we can with us. The two scientists set about packing the collected samples and ice cores as safely as they could in the rush. After about 15 minutes, the most important items were stowed away in boxes and suitcases. "Corporal!" Sterling called out to the soldier waiting next to the door with a cigarette in the corner of his mouth. "Help us with the luggage." The soldier let out an unwilling grunt, threw his cigarette on the ground, and grabbed some suitcases to carry outside. Sterling and Memphis also grabbed as much as they could with both hands. After one last look back to check whether they had forgotten anything important, the two of them left the hut that had been their laboratory for the past year and a half. It's strange. First, you think this godforsaken place could never feel like home, and now that you have to leave it forever, it doesn't feel right either, commented Memphis, putting his suitcases on the back of a snowmobile that was parked next to the cabin. The vehicle and the sled attached to it were already loaded to the maximum, but Sterling squeezed in 2 more crates. Don't worry about it. For people like us, the place where we work is irrelevant. What's important is what we achieve with what we do, he said. We're leaving now. The corporal interrupted the conversation and climbed onto the snowmobile. The doctors will have to walk, he added, only half-heartedly suppressing a grin. The sleigh is too full and there's no time to drive twice. He lit a new cigarette and started the engine. Drive off, and don't you dare lose a single piece of luggage, Sterling ordered him. We're good on foot. The soldier shrugged his shoulders, stepped on the gas, and left the two scientists alone in the ice tunnel. Don't panic, Sterling now said to Memphis. Wurlitz won't leave us behind. These guys always allow for a buffer. They set off and walked through the deserted tunnel towards the exit. Barely 2 minutes later, they heard a rumble and a muffled scream. They instinctively stopped. What was that? Asked Memphis. Instead of a reply, he heard a shot, then a second, followed by a screech. That's coming from over there, from the parallel tunnel, Sterling shouted, pointing to a narrow passageway that led across. Another shot rang out, then a furious scream, just a single word, a name. Sattler. Did you hear that? Memphis asked. Come on, we have to go and see, said Sterling. Are you crazy? Those were gunshots. If it was Sattler, we have to take care of him. He's one of our people. The military will shoot him. And maybe us too, if we get in their way, protested Memphis. Nonsense. I'm sure it won't come to that. Sterling defended himself and pulled open the door to the connecting corridor. That's the stupidest idea in a long time, Memphis commented, following Sterling through the door. They ran along the narrow corridor to the second large tunnel that ran the length of the underground base. Here were mainly the military supply depots, the reactor room, the infirmary, and access to a separate area where secret missile silos were housed. As scientists on a semi-civilian project, Memphis and Sterling only had access to the infirmary, and were basically not even supposed to know that there were dozens of missiles stuck in the ice over there. But it was a small base, and people were talking. They pushed open the door to the parallel tunnel and immediately saw a dark red trail of blood on the ice. They hurriedly followed it and found a soldier a few meters further on, leaning against the wall, wounded and holding his radio in front of his mouth with trembling hands. When he recognized the two, he lowered it and explained, "It's Sattler, the son of a bitch. Somehow he got out of the infirmary." "But how can that be?" asked Sterling incredulously. "He was unconscious. The doctors told me they wanted to wait until the last moment to see if he was even fit to be transferred." "I don't know." The soldier gasped and then had a coughing fit. He spat blood onto the floor. "He's armed. I couldn't stop it," he gasped. "Where is he going?" Memphis asked. At that moment, a shrill alarm sounded, echoing in the smooth tunnel and piercing the ear canal. "What does that mean?" asked Sterling, looking around frantically. "The missile silo," the soldier replied. "Sattler must have tried to get in." Memphis felt himself getting hotter and hotter under his jacket, despite the cold around him. What was Sattler doing in the missile silo? Could he even manage to get in there? The guy had been out for days with a fever of over 40 degrees. Had he run off in a frenzy and was now doing some fatal nonsense? "We have to stop him," Sterling said firmly. "What?" Memphis blurted out. "Not the two of us?" "I've already radioed for reinforcements. They're on their way, but there's only one open access at the far end." The soldier coughed again. "We're alone down here." "This is taking too long," Sterling explained. "Who knows what he's up to?" The door to the connecting corridor through which Memphis and Sterling had just stepped was pushed open, and the corporal in charge of transporting the equipment came running to them. "What happened?" "Sattler. He wants to go into the missile silo," said the wounded soldier curtly. "Hang on. Someone will be here to help you in a minute," the corporal explained and wheeled around. He immediately pressed a pistol into Memphis's hand and pulled a second one from a holster on his belt. "Come on," he barked at him and Sterling. "Now we're going to kill the madman. You can shoot, can't you?" Before Memphis could protest, the corporal shoved him towards the far end of the tunnel. The three of them ran through the icy corridor and reached an airlock area that concealed the secret missile silos. For Memphis, this part of the base had previously been absolutely off-limits. At least 2 heavily armed guards normally secured the entrance, but now the heavy steel gate stood wide open. There was not a guard to be seen for miles around. "Bloody hell, how did he get in there? It should have been locked long ago," said the corporal, stopping right in front of the gate. He cautiously peered into the dark corridor behind it. The next moment, his head burst into a storm of blood, brain matter, and bone splinters. "Fuck!" Memphis gasped and threw himself to the ground. "Sattler, don't shoot! It's us! Sterling and Memphis!" Sterling shouted into the darkness. "Can we come in and talk?" "Are you crazy?" Memphis breathlessly breathed. His whole body was trembling. "He knows us. He trusts us," said Sterling calmly. "I don't give a shit," hissed Memphis. "The Sattler I knew didn't just shoot a soldier in the head like that." "Right. That's why we have to talk some sense into him. You know what's down there?" "Yes, the damn rockets," Memphis replied a little more calmly. "Yes, nuclear-capable missiles. At least a dozen," Sterling clarified. "What? But—" "Sterling!" shouted Sattler from the missile silo. "You and Memphis can come, but if I see anyone else, I'll shoot." "Shit," Memphis commented. "Now, we have to get down to that lunatic." Sterling pulled Memphis to his feet. "It's either that or—" He left the sentence unfinished and stepped towards the gate instead. Memphis shook his head. Nuclear missiles. He had always feared that, but had suppressed the thought as best he could. He came to his senses and scraped together the last of his courage. They had to do something before a catastrophe happened here. They walked through the airlock together and found a wide steel staircase less than 10 meters behind it, which led down a good 20 meters. There were 3 tunnels at the bottom, just high enough to walk upright in. The lighting had failed, and only a pitiful remnant of light shone from above. Nevertheless, it was not completely dark. At the end of the right hand of the 3 shafts, a diffuse glow could be made out that shimmered between violet and pink. "What the hell is that?" Memphis asked in a whisper, as if speaking too loudly could set a catastrophe in motion. "You know what that is," said Sterling succinctly. "The reason we have to leave." "Back here," shouted Sattler from the very tunnel where they saw the glow. "Hurry up! Please, let's get out of here and let the soldiers handle this." Memphis tried one last time to talk some sense into his colleague, but Sterling set off unmoved. Memphis reluctantly followed him. Despite the ever-increasing fear that was spreading through his body, he felt the scientific curiosity within him. He hated having to give up on this discovery, without any real clarity about what exactly they had found here. He hid the pistol in his jacket pocket and entered the tunnel with deliberate steps behind Sterling. This ended after about 50 meters on a kind of platform on which a control console stood. There were 5 more narrow shafts around it, which led to the actual rocket launch ramps. There was no sign of Sattler, but it was now clear where the glow was coming from. It shimmered directly out of the ice, like pulsating veins under thin skin. They seemed to come from deep below and ran up the walls and into the corridors that led to the rockets. "What on earth is going on here?" Memphis breathed. "That's them," explained Sattler, stepping out of the darkness with his gun drawn. Thick beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. His skin was unnaturally pale, and his veins were bulging out as if his blood pressure was beyond the measurable range. "Sattler, why aren't you in the infirmary? You look terrible," said Sterling. "What I look like is completely irrelevant. I'm beyond help. They're already inside me. I have to end this before I lose control," explained Sattler, and stepped up to the missile console. "What are you up to?" asked Memphis. "Well, what is it? I'm going to save you all and die a hero's death in the process. Me of all people. What a fucking irony." "Heroes," Memphis began, and immediately broke off again. "You're not going to set off the rockets, are you?" "We don't have time to discuss it. Save yourselves. Get the soldiers off my back. Get everyone out of here. It's going to get very uncomfortable here soon." "What did you mean when you said they were inside you?" Sterling wanted to know. "Those damn things. Look around you. They're coming up from the depths. We drilled these holes and woke them up. Then they somehow got into the reactor's radioactive cooling water. That changed them. I don't know how. You can see the glow. And I was stupid enough to touch them." Sattler rolled up the sleeve of his shirt on his left arm and turned it so that the underside could be seen. The veins were not only distended here, but seemed to glow pinkish-purple under the milky skin, just like the ice around them. Startled, Memphis took a step back. "I told you, I'm beyond help," Sattler repeated. "What happened over there in the reactor?" asked Sterling. "Overheating. The temperature under the base rises as they spread. Still. They've already taken the reactor away," said Sterling. "That's not enough. All the radioactive waste is still there. They seem to be feeding on it. I don't have time to explain everything to you. You have to leave. I'll ignite the rockets but won't release the holding clamps. That will cause a massive meltdown. Everything will sink." "Then we have to get out of here," said Sterling. "This will have a devastating effect on the stability of the base. They've already filled in the openings of the missile silos above." "What good does it do us to set off the missiles?" Memphis interjected. "You say they destroy radioactive radiation. How could nuclear missiles, of all things, help us?" "Trust me. I'm convinced that it will work. The missiles are not equipped. I can feel this alien presence inside me, and now I know how to get them. The rocket fuel is our salvation, not the bombs." "You talk like these things think," said Sterling. "You have no idea," Sattler roared. "Now get out of here." "Come with us, we'll find another way," Memphis asked. "There is no other way, aren't you listening to me? You are inside me. I'm part of the problem." He waved the pistol in the air. "Get out!" he then shouted and put his free hand on the control console. "I have to stay here and lock the retaining clamps manually. I'll give you 10 minutes, and make sure the soldiers stay outside. Otherwise—" He didn't finish the sentence, but just shook his head briefly. Then he pressed the launch buttons of all 5 missiles stationed in this silo, one after the other. "The clock is ticking." Memphis turned on his heel and pulled Sterling with him. He pushed him ahead through the narrow corridor and up the stairs. The pink-purple mesh still pulsed and glowed beneath the surface of the ice. They had barely stepped out of the large gate when 3 soldiers came running towards them. Memphis stepped forward and waved his arms in the air. "We have to get out! He's firing the rockets!" he shouted. But the soldiers made no move to slow down or even turn around. "It's too late! Turn around!" he shouted again. The men were barely 10 meters away. One of them raised his rifle. "What are you doing?" he shouted in amazement and turned around. Then he saw that Sterling had stayed behind and was pulling the heavy steel gate shut from the inside. "Sterling, no!" shouted Memphis. In the next moment, bullets rattled against the gate, which was now locked. They did not cause any damage, but only ricocheted off as sparks. The soldiers continued to fire, although they must have known that it was absolutely pointless to try to open the entrance in this way. Memphis didn't waste another second. He ran off, straight towards the exit. The lights flickered and went out again and again, but he no longer cared. Darkness was the least of his problems. If he didn't get out of here as quickly as possible, he wouldn't have any more problems, because he would be dead, first consumed by a fireball and then buried by thousands of tons of ice. Memphis switched to the parallel tunnel, the end of which would lead to freedom. He found the snowmobile parked by the corporal halfway down the tunnel and sent a prayer of thanks to heaven. He hastily mounted it and sped off. Half the load fell off during the breakneck ride, but Memphis couldn't be bothered. It was probably better if it all stayed buried here. At last he reached the ramp that led to the last open exit. The large gates had already been closed except for a narrow gap. He struggled out and landed directly in a veritable snowstorm. The sharp wind blew ice crystals into his eyes. Memphis was as good as blind and staggered towards a noise that sounded like the engine of a large snowcat. He stumbled and went down, still completely disoriented without his goggles. He felt someone pulling him to his feet and pushing him into the vehicle cabin. "What the hell is going on down there? Where's Sterling?" they shouted at him. Memphis blinked and realized that it was Wurlitz, sitting opposite him with a bright red head and glaring angrily at him. "No time! Drive!" shouted Memphis. "Everything's about to go off! Sattler's firing the rockets!" He thought he saw sheer terror in Major Wurlitz's eyes for a moment, but the commander immediately regained his composure. "Off you go!" he ordered the driver. "Go!" He didn't hesitate and pressed the gas pedal to the metal. The caterpillar started to move, roaring but still agonizingly slowly before picking up speed. "God have mercy on you if you lied to me," Wurlitz said sharply and poked Memphis in the chest with his index finger. "God have mercy on us if Sattler's plan doesn't work," Memphis replied wanly and slumped back in his seat, completely exhausted. A few minutes later, the top-secret Camp Century in eastern Greenland was history. The rocket's engines unleashed their devastating power and caused the ice to collapse over a funnel that had melted into the glacier. Underneath it buried Sattler, Sterling, half a dozen brave soldiers, and a tremendous secret that would never see the light of day again. Or so they thought.